Did you know that light can have a huge impact on our body and health? Not only does it influence when and how well we sleep, but it can also affect our mood, alertness, and even our behavior. Welcome to Light O'Clock! In this podcast, we unpack the science behind body clocks and how light influences our daily biological rhythms. In each episode, we chat to experts in the field and have them break down the scientific topics so you can be enlightened. On January 27, 1890, Thomas Edison received a patent for the invention of the electric light. Little did he know that this invention would massively change the way people live and work, and still does to these days. But have you ever wondered how that invention actually changed the way that our biology works? Today on the podcast, we're asking the question, why should we care about our light exposure? And we're joined by Manuel Spitschan. Manuel is a professor in chronobiology and health at the Technical University of Munich and a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen, Germany. Manuel, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Today we want to talk about the importance of light for human health, physical and mental health. And we can't really talk about the effects of light on human health without talking about the effects of light on what we call circadian rhythms or our circadian system. And I think maybe listeners have an understanding for this or have heard about this before, that we have these 24 hours rhythms in our bodies, in our cells. But before we jump into what circadian rhythms do and where they come from, maybe we could just define the word circadian. What does it mean and what do people mean when we say that we have a circadian rhythm?
So the word circadian really is consisting of two parts. It's circa, diem. And circa means approximately. And of course, diem is related to the day. And so circadian, just by etymology, refers to processes that are approximately 24 hours. And through the last 50 years or so of chronobiology, what we've come to appreciate is that there are circadian rhythms in physiological processes that persist even if you take out any environmental stimuli that might help you put on this 24-hour rhythm. So, the obvious, what we call Zeitgeber, is the light-dark cycle, and that is just given by the Earth's rotation around the sun, right? So the amount of light that we have available depends on how much daylight there is really available. Of course, this has changed a little bit with electric light, but overall, the primary factor in driving the external light-dark cycle is, of course, daylight and sunlight. And one of the key realizations or the key findings and discoveries in chronobiology is that this rhythmicity that happens over a 24-hour scale in a lot of physiological processes persists even when you take out the external light-dark cycle. And so what this tells us is that there is a clock that, of course, is synchronized under normal conditions to the light-dark cycle and other stimuli, but it is there even when it's gone. And so there were some really, really fascinating and groundbreaking studies done in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, where people were put into time-free conditions. So there were cave experiments, people lived in caves for a while, or the famous Andex bunker experiments, where people came to appreciate, these physiological processes and also rhythms and behavior persisted even in the absence of any external stimulus. And what this basically means is that we have an endogenous circadian clock, a clock that is within us, that is really connected to the environment through the circadian synchronization process.
And do other species that also evolved on planet Earth, so they were also exposed to this 24-hour light-dark cycles in evolution, do they also have the circadian rhythms that humans have?
Yeah, primarily because, I think there's certain times during the day that, it will be more dangerous to be awake or to be out and about because you are prey to something, right? So I think you see these 24-hour cycles all throughout nature. I think it's a fundamental, biological property. I think you'll be very hard to find organisms that are not organized by the 24-hour cycle. And I think for us humans, I think it's pretty noticeable, right? Because we structure most of human activity, which fundamentally is social, right, as well, around the availability of daylight and around when we're awake.
So are these rhythms something that we already have when we are in the womb?
of our mothers? Or is this something we develop later on in life?
So this is a postnatal development. So we only develop kind of consolidated sleep-wake cycles and rhythms in, for example, the production of hormones around somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks after birth. And so it depends a little bit on which marker of the biological clock you're looking at. I think cortisol is generally thought to be the one that develops first, so cortisol rhythms. But, you have a kind of a development or start of development of these rhythms throughout, the earliest stages of infanthood.
So basically, we have these light and dark patterns from the environment. And then we also follow these rhythms because we evolved on a planet that has these patterns, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work on like a biological basis? Like, is there a part of the brain that is telling the rest of the body, hi, it's light outside, time to be active, or hello, darkness, time to sleep?
Exactly. So we have deeply buried in our brains a small structure. It's about the size of a grain of rice that is considered to be what we call the biological substrate of our clock. And so what these cells in the brain are doing is they're active during specific parts of the day and less active during other parts of the day. We consider that structure in the brain to be kind of the conductor of an orchestra. And the way you got to think about this is that in our body, we have lots of cells that do different things. And almost all cells in our body are synchronized to a 24-hour rhythm. They follow a biological circadian rhythm. And what this conductor does in the brain, it basically tells the cells in the body when it is time to be active, what time it is internally, to basically make sure all the cells in the body are synchronized. Now, of course, somehow this conductor must also know what time it is outside and what the light-dark conditions are, right? So, of course, if you have a conductor, it needs to be synchronized to a rhythm. And so that structure in the brain is connected with the eyes. And so the eyes, of course, sense and perceive light, and that information then gets sent to the conductor to basically say, oh, hold on, it's morning, or hold on, it's biological night.
So we see light from the environment, and this is giving information to our eyes. The eyes are relaying the information to this little grain of rice in the brain, the suprachiasmatic.
It's not a real grain of rice, right? It's just the size of a grain of rice.
And this then sends the information to the rest of the body.
Yeah.
And this is how we have this synchrony between the environment and these 24 hours patterns in the environment and our 24-hour rhythms.
Exactly. So you can think of kind of the eye as the interface between the external environment and our internal clock, internal system.
So if light is so important to set our internal biological rhythms, is all light the same? Like throughout the day, I'm exposed to all different types of light. So I'm biking outside, there's sunshine, and then here we are recording in this room and it's like just electric light. Mm-hmm. How does different light make an impact on the biological clock?
I think to answer this question, we need to really consider the physics of light. And when we look at, how light works, we have multiple ways or multiple words that we can use to describe light. We can think of light as something that is defined by the wavelength. And we, of course, can think of light as something that is defined in intensity. Now, wavelength is a fundamental property, a fundamental characteristic of light that is composed of energy at different wavelengths. And how much energy there is at a wavelength basically tells us the intensity. And when we are, exposed to, I guess the light source that we're most commonly exposed to is some variant of daylight. And then what we have in daylight is we have basically photons, so light of all wavelengths, almost all wavelengths. And of course, how is daylight generated? It comes from the sun and then gets filtered through the atmosphere. And depending on, if there's, depending on what the weather conditions or the cloud conditions are, the spectrum of daylight looks a little bit different, sometimes a little more bluish, sometimes it's a little bit more orange. But that is, the light source that we're most commonly exposed to or most habitually exposed to when we're outside and, of course, coming through windows. And, it's quite distinct from what we see in electric lighting, which is not as broadband and typically also not as bright. So there have been, over the many decades since the invention of electric light, different technologies to generate artificial light or electric light. And the most recent one, the one that is now kind of standard, is LED lighting. So this is light-emitting diodes technology that basically, can also now produce light of very, very different wavelength composition, and also can be made quite bright with relative high energy efficiency. When we're talking about the physics of light, though, this is just about what I just talked about is just about the light sources. In rooms, even in this one, which is relatively sparse in a way, you have light coming from a light source and interacting with surfaces, right? Like the table, like, your face, like your skin, like our clothing. And of course, this changes a little bit how much light is actually received in the eyes. So the physics of light can take us to a certain level to understand, okay, what are the different spectra? But ultimately, it's the real environment that we interact in that determines how much light we receive in our eyes.
So what we just described is different types of light and how this can affect differently the biological clock. How about the time of light? Is bright light in the evening or in the morning the same to our biological clock? So does it send the same signal?
Right. So through the pathway that connects the eye with the brain and the circadian clock in the brain, we receive these light signals, and it really is exquisitely dependent on when this light is received, what the biological effect is. So light in the morning, the same light in the morning, has a fundamentally different impact on the circadian clock as light in the evening. And so if you think about the clock as something that can be shifted, right? So kind of if you think about an actual clock where you kind of have a thing that you can change, think about your wristwatch, the circadian clock can be shifted forward or it can be shifted backward. So we can change our internal time by bright light exposure. So it turns out that light in the morning advances, so moves forward our circadian clock, and light in the evening delays our circadian clock, right? So this is an example for how the environmental conditions that we're in can move around the circadian clock and move around our biological rhythms.
Right. So when you say like bright light in the evening can delay the clock, would that mean that we fall asleep later?
This is one of the consequences of it. So I think when we are looking at delaying the clock, these are data largely from lab experiments in which we can exactly pinpoint, here's a light exposure in the evening, and the next day we see a shift in the rhythm of a specific hormone in the body, which is called melatonin. We often use melatonin as a biomarker for the circadian rhythm. Melatonin is not produced during the day and sort of starts in production in the evening, and we can shift when that starting point happens. Typically, this is only done in laboratory experiments, but in principle, if your circadian rhythm is shifted, then of course, other processes, including your sleep-wake cycle, will also be shifted.
Going back to the light sources and the sort of patterns of light exposure that we encounter in our daily lives, you've coined this term light diet or spectral diet to describe sort of the variety of different light sources that we have and we're exposed to, with a metaphor to food intake. Do you want to explain to us what that means?
Yeah, so the idea here is basically that, we can consider kind of all of the light that we get at different parts of the day as part of, what we feed our circadian clock with. And ultimately, I think we have specific light levels that we should reach during the day and we should avoid during the night. And it's kind of like thinking about, the intake of macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, etc., protein. I think you want to make sure that the balance of light exposure during the day and during the night is right. And so generally, I think we can summarize what we need in terms of light by saying we want bright days and dark nights, right? So the brighter the day, the better. And also, of course, the darker the night, the better.
So would you say that means we have to take some actions to make our days bright? For example, in the office or at home, what kind of actions can individuals take to ensure that they get the right light exposure throughout the day?
So I think this really depends on kind of the context you're in, right? So if you're in an office, oftentimes it's not really easy to add or change anything about the lighting. But of course you can, do simple things like taking, going on a walk in the morning to expose yourself to bright light in the morning, or taking your lunch outside, right? This is relatively straightforward. Of course, then in the evening, when you want to avoid light exposure, you want to minimize the use of self-emitting devices. You want to minimize ambient illumination. But ultimately, I think there's a lot that we can do that goes beyond just changing the lighting in our environment.
You were talking about the fact that we need bright days and dark nights. And I can think of two reasons why nowadays we don't get dark nights, and we also were discussing them. So one is, we're exposed to smartphones, laptops, electric light in the evening, so that's why we don't get dark nights. But another reason, which is perhaps not really our choice, is the light that we have in the streets, for example, right? So street lighting. If I live in London, there's a very high likelihood that I have a lot of street lighting outside my flat compared, for example, if I live in a little village in the Alps. Would you say that we live in a light polluted world?
100%. I mean, I think there is plenty of evidence that has shown that the amount of artificial light that is available at night has risen over the last decades or so. And of course, this is important for us as human chronobiologists or scientists interested in understanding how light affects human physiology and behavior. But it also is much more interesting for another group, and that's astronomers, because they observed very early on, well, you can't look at the stars if the sky is light polluted. And so there's a really interesting, fascinating group of interdisciplinary researchers that have really been trying to tease apart, what constitutes light pollution, what are the levels, and how have they been increasing. And of course, it not only affects us, it also affects the fauna and the flora around us, right? So wildlife is immensely impacted by the availability of light at night when it shouldn't really be there. I think there is a lot of work that has to be done on this. And I think one of the interesting things is to think about is, well, what simple interventions could there be, right? So you can imagine this as an exercise where you look at different ways that you can reduce light pollution at the individual level, at the household level, at the street lighting or policy level, then if you're thinking about lighting policy of communities. And I think ultimately, these things need to work together, right? So I think, it might help me personally if I put on an eye mask that helps me sleep because it means, I don't get light. But of course, my neighbor might not have this. And, I think there's a lot of work that really we need to put into reducing artificial light exposure at night. And I think there is a drive, I think, to understanding which exposures specifically are bad for us. We know that light at night disrupts our circadian system. It disrupts our cardiometabolic function. And I think the question is just, well, which limits can we accept?
Yeah. Do you feel like there is more research that is needed to show that this is actually super important for our health? Or do you think there's already, let's say, the research is there, but there is a gap between the research that shows this and the policy implementation?
I mean, I think there's kind of two evidence bases, if we're thinking about those. One is really looking at laboratory studies where people come to the lab, we expose them to very well-controlled light conditions, and learn, how is melatonin changing, how's your metabolism, how's your heart, response changing in response to light. And then there's other studies that really have looked at large-scale kind of epidemiological evidence, looking at, in large-scale surveys, we see that, the amount of light exposure you get will influence certain aspects of mood, for example. I think those types of studies or those lines of evidence are converging, showing that light is incredibly important for human health, both physical and mental. But I think there's a lot more that we don't really understand. I think one aspect of this is really, understanding to what extent the effects of light that we see in the laboratory can directly be applied to real-world conditions. And so one aspect of this is that in the lab, we control lots of things. We control light exposure, posture in many cases. We control the sleep-wake cycle. We control food intake, water intake in certain cases. And that is not really, it depends a little bit on how you live your life, but it's not really reflective of, how most people will live their life, which, involves nutrition at the wrong time and, exercise and so on. And so I think we're missing a little bit a gap, or there's a little bit of a gap that we need to fill, bridging very well-controlled laboratory studies with evidence that would then allow us to formulate policies.
Yeah, creating science for applications in the real world that can inform policies that ultimately can improve people's light exposure and overall health. I think this is a perfect note to end our first episode of Light O'Clock, underlying the very positive effect of light on human health, or at least light at the right time on human health. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to speak to you, and I very much look forward to all the other episodes that we will be recording.
Thank you for having me.
Many thanks to Manuel Spitschan for joining us today on the topic of circadian rhythms and light exposure. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in into this first episode of Light O'Clock. We hope you found it enlightening, just as we did. And if you caught that pun and you're interested to know more on today's topic, you can check out the show notes for relevant links and resources. And sticking to the word puns, we would be delighted to hear from you. If you have any feedback, questions, and ideas for future episodes, feel free to reach out. You can write to us on our email, which is just in the show notes. Hope to see you here for the next episode, where Maidel Fernandez Alonso will take us on the journey that light takes from the environment all the way to our retina and make us see things and tell time of day. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast to get it as soon as it's on air. And until then, don't forget to lighten up your clock.